Hi everyone, welcome back to Guide to the Global Economy. I'm Sophia Busch, an assistant director with the GeoEconomics Center. I'm filling in for Josh Lipsky this week, and we're going to talk about the team's research. So first, we're going to talk about Ecuador's economic relationship with Russia. We're also going to talk about the upcoming WTO Ministerial Conference. But first, I'm going to talk to Niels about our lead.
Hey, Sophia. So this week, commemorating the 2-year anniversary of Russia's legal invasion of Ukraine, we decided to focus on the sort of economic implications of this. And we wanted to do a real deep dive into Russia's trading relationship. And that's been the real focus of the lead this week.
Okay, great. Let's take a look.
So really, as you can see in the graph, what we're really looking at is sort of how has Russia been able to restabilize its economy, especially its import economy, following a combination of sort of G7 sanctions and sort of a broader coalition the G7 has put together, as well as broader Western moral outrage along with Russia's invasion, where a number of companies have pulled out of Russia, even beyond the sort of legal requirements here. And
so let's figure out what we're looking at here. So I'm seeing a big drop off. That's after the invasion. I'm assuming that's because of sanctions and export controls.
Exactly, right? So in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, going back 2 years ago, it was a real surprise, I think, firstly, for a lot of firms. It was a real sudden sort of invasion. A lot of folks in the immediate aftermath were saying this is not going to happen. It's just a troop buildup. So that's the sort of a massive drop-off you see there, where so many companies, so many sort of organizations are trying to figure out what are we going to do now that this kind of massive tectonic shift has happened in the geopolitical landscape. And what you really saw is particularly for G7 exports, but also broadly globally, and you see this within the China line as well, exports drastically fell. So G7 in the immediate aftermath, exports dropped some about like 50, a little bit over 50%. And afterwards, it slowly recovered. This was a combination of a few different factors, first of which was sort of coming to terms with the invasion. A lot of things still weren't clear. Companies were still trying to figure out what are my operations looking like in Russia? What are my legal obligations to the US? How do I personally feel about this? On top of that, you had long-term contracts that now returned into force. So you did see some delivery of goods overall. But on top of that, long-term wise, we do see a decline in sort of G7 trade really focused on the EU.
Okay, so this is not just because of firms being directly impacted by sanctions, but them trying to navigate the environment. Okay, and what we're looking at is values, not share.
Exactly. So the graph itself shows a 3-month rolling average of imports. And this is also why it doesn't seem as stark, the initial drop-off. If you look at the pure trade data, the jump is a little bit more, but we do a 3-month rolling average to kind of smooth out some of the seasonality in between the individual data. But either way, we have this immediate stark drop, 50% in total imports, and then we have a slow recovery, not really from kind of your traditional sources of Russian imports, namely the EU, but rather this real stark rise in imports from China in particular.
Is this just part of China's post-COVID recovery? Is it just within the trend line?
No, I think a few different things are at play here. First, a lot of the attention in Washington has been focused on really the direct support China has provided the sort of Russian military effort. When I say that, I'm not saying explicit direct lethal aid. This is still a red line that China has yet to cross.
Okay.
But this is the sort of industrial support, sending Russia things like rubber, chemicals, raw materials, iron, a range of different minerals it needs to keep its war machine, war economy running. So this is part of it. On top of this, it speaks to a broader trend within Russia. And you can kind of see, if we go back to kind of 2020 and even beyond, there's been a slow rise in terms of Chinese imports or Chinese exports to Russia overall. And this speaks to a longer term partnership Russia and China have been pursuing really since 2016 of tying the two economies closer and closer together. So it's kind of, you have to take it within that context as well, where you would see a lot of this increase with or without the invasion. The invasion did, however, supercharge it and really allow this partnership to blossom in new ways.
Okay, so is it just these sort of industrial goods and inputs, or is there anything else that's going on here?
No, it's primary industrial goods are a real large portion of it. Same with the sort of mechanical inputs that you need to kind of again run a wartime economy, whether it's building different things you need for sort of military equipment. But on top of this, it's just a complete reorientation of the Russian economy away from traditional suppliers like the EU towards China. So we're really seeing a flood of consumer goods from China to Russia. And I think cars are a real great example of this. The immediate aftermath of the invasion, a lot of Western car manufacturers pulled out of their joint ventures within within Russian car companies. On top of that, cars were one of the different goods that were really banned, especially luxury cars, by the G7. So what you saw is a complete reorientation towards the Chinese car market, and Chinese imports or Chinese exports to Russia of cars jumped 900% when you compare 2019 to 2023. And this is shared across a range of other goods, but I think cars are really illustrative of this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty intense data point. But okay, if I'm looking at this chart again, so the EU exports drop, but then they rise again. So what is making up that rise? Like, what is the EU still exporting?
Sure. So there's a range of goods that are firstly kind of exempt from sanctions. So what you're seeing in terms of the remaining EU exports is sort of, I guess, 3 trillion or $3 billion worth of goods a month coming out of the EU are a combination of things that are exempt entirely from sanctions, and these are things like pharmaceuticals. So pharmaceuticals, EU is still sending around 600 million a month or so.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, you have a lot of foodstuffs as well. The EU is a large agriculture producer. This is one area, for example, where China has not really been able to pick up. China is not a big food exporter, so the EU has continued to send food to Russia overall. On top of that, there are a range of other goods, just kind of strange things that aren't sanctioned. Things like Spanish perfumes, for example, or
Okay.
maybe specific cookingware goods that are built in the Baltics, for example,
Mhm.
that aren't necessarily sanctioned and that the G7 may move towards sanctioning, but they've gotten a lot of pushback up to now. I think the other real important thing to remember is that Russia is buying a lot of these goods, but these goods are the livelihood of so many different EU sort of producers, different mom and pop shops, and so forth. So there's a real pushback right now on the EU side, especially on kind of the increasing ban of non sort of war effort vital goods overall. We have to balance the pain that we are putting on the Russian economy with the sort of corresponding pain that different producers, especially in the EU, are feeling. And that's the real tight walk the G7 has to walk right now. And that's the real reason why, since really in the past 8 or so months, we haven't really seen substantial new efforts to kind of harm trade between the G7 and Russia overall. But going forward, I think I want to really echo the points that it's going to be very, very hard to further disintermediate the trade between sort of G7 and Russia. We've already touched on kind of these key goods, but that doesn't mean it's not necessarily possible. And I think one key example of this is of the recent sanctions packages that Biden has promised around the death of Russian opposition leader Alexander Navalny. And we could see this further impact trade flows, especially as the war drags on to the third year. There may be more support to take additional action. So we could see this picture sort of muddling in the future. But as of right now, as you can kind of see in the final few bars of the graph, at least Russia's import story has really stabilized and returned back to the 2019 levels.
Is there anything we should be thinking about that maybe could be risky?
Sure. So just as China, or just as Russia is increasingly turning to China for these different goods in the short term, it's really helping their war effort. In the long run, it's really building a strong dependency from Russia onto China. This is what we're seeing when folks talk about the new vacillation of Russia to China overall, comparing it to the relationship maybe the Soviet Union and China had back in the 1960s, except the tables are now flipped, with China being the sort of dominant partner here. I think that's totally fair. Russia has few other places to turn, and it's going to
Mhm.
be increasingly tying its economy, its livelihood, to the Chinese economy. But I also don't want to diminish the sort of Chinese side of this as well. As China is increasingly turning to Russia to buy its different goods, it's facing really strong headwinds around the world. Chinese trade from 2022 to 2023 dropped about 5% in dollar terms. For Russia, this was a surge of about 43%. Russia is really the only large economy that China is still seeing rapid trade growth with, and especially as countries like the EU in particular turn away from Chinese goods with their things like their EV probe. They just recently announced a new probe on subsidies of Chinese trains. They are going to need new markets to absorb these different goods, and Russia is a key example of it. So while I don't want to diminish the sort of relationship that Russia is incredibly reliant on China, China too needs Russia as a new sort of export market where it can buy the goods that it's no longer being able to sell in its own domestic market or abroad in places like the EU or the United States.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Niels. We'll keep an eye on this.
Thank you.
Okay, for the next section, we're going to talk to Alessandra, who's one of our young global professionals with the GeoEconomics Center. Hey, Alessandra.
Hi, Sophia.
Okay, so you looked into Ecuador this week. What made you look into it, and what did you find?
Yeah, thanks, Sophia, for this question. So, when I was starting brainstorming a bit for this edition of the Guide to the Global Economy, I wanted to find a story connected to some major cultural pop events happening during the season. And of course, I thought about Carnival. So I started doing research on Latin America, and then I found this story. Very interesting story about Ecuador. Basically, I discovered this tweet published by the newly elected president, President Noboa of Ecuador. He's only 36 years old, so a very young leader that published this video when he tells about this exchange that he was planning to do with the US. And this exchange involved weapons. And particularly, they wanted to exchange scrap metal coming from Ecuador to the US in exchange of new, modern US made military equipment.
Okay, so he's saying this on social media.
Yeah.
So is it scrap metal? Is it what exactly is actually happening?
Well, it's not really scrap metal. Actually, he's referring to Russian old military equipment that was created during the Soviet era, and its value is about $200 million. So it's not really scrap metal, and it can actually be very useful for military purposes, especially maybe in Ukraine.
Okay, so the US doesn't actually want these old weapons that they're calling scrap metal, but how are they able to send it to Ukraine? How is all of this actually happening?
Yeah, it's interesting. So basically, the US made this deal with Noboa, saying that they will give to Ecuador this US-made equipment in exchange of Russian-made weapons. The point here is that the US does not really want to use that Russian-made weapons, but instead President Biden wants to direct this equipment to a third country, which is indeed Ukraine. This was not super clear from the original deal, but it was then discovered that this was the real intentions behind this agreement between the two countries.
Okay. So, but why does Ukraine want old weapons? Why wouldn't we just be able to send them the new weapons?
Yeah, so it's very convenient for Ukrainians using old Russian-made weapons for several reasons. First of all, most of their equipment at the beginning of the war was made of Russian-made weapons, especially coming from the Soviet era. So they are feeling already comfortable with using this type of weapons. And also, this type of donation complements what they already have. So it's quite useful. In addition to that, sending US-made weapons will not really be convenient because it will also involve sending American soldiers to explain to Ukrainians how to use this equipment. And another aspect to consider is that through these swaps, the US can also engage with other countries, in this case, Ecuador. So it's also a way for the US to improve their alliances in other regions. So it's a mix of factors.
Right, okay. That makes sense. But, I mean, I'm sure Russia couldn't have been happy about this. And even though they're calling it scrap metal, I'm sure that's, a pretty easy thing to see through.
Exactly. They knew that it wasn't about scrap metal.
Right.
It was about serious military equipment. And because of that, after a few days after this deal between Noboa and Biden, the Russian Foreign Ministry decided to ban banana imports coming from the 5 biggest banana companies in Ecuador. And this is actually a very important decision because Russia is the main importer of Ecuador's banana sales, and this would represent a significant hit, causing potentially 20% of market drop. So it's yeah, it's pretty significant. And of course, this was the reason why they put this decision in place was not so clear cut. They first said that this was because of a suspected disease found in previous shipments, but the Ecuador Food Agency disagree with this position. They said that only 0.3% of previous shipments was affected by this pest. So probably there are other reasons behind this choice.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. So it seems like it would be reasonable to conclude that this was a retaliatory economic measure.
It's reasonable, and we can also further justify this conclusion by considering the most recent updates about this story, because just a few days ago we discovered that actually Ecuador reversed its decision to engage with the US in this exchange of weapons, and just after Ecuador made this change its position, Russia decided to end its ban on banana sales. So,
okay, so they made the decision, Russia retaliated, and now everything's reversed.
exactly, yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's okay, so this is really interesting, but is this, I mean, it seems kind of like a niche issue. Is it just like US, Ecuador, Russia, or are there any other impacts or global implications?
Yeah. Apparently, it's not that niche. Okay. So, from what we can really understand from this story is that the US is finding new ways to arm Ukraine and to support Ukraine's war efforts. The way the US is trying to do that is by gathering Russian-made weapons for the reasons we said before, and they can find this type of situation in other countries, not only Ecuador. We can have countries rich in Russian-made weapons, especially in Latin America, so we can expect an increase in this type of swaps and exchanges in that region. But on top of that, we can also say that US is already engaging with other countries in this type of exchanges, like Greece, so even outside this region. So we will probably going to look at these exchanges happening more often in the future.
Okay, so do you have any examples of like other Latin American countries that could be involved here?
Yeah, one country, for example, is Brazil. We also have Nicaragua. So there are many different countries that we could mention. The main point is that the US is looking for countries rich in this old type of equipment.
Okay, well, thanks, Alessandra. That was a really interesting find and really good research, and I think we should keep our eye on Brazil.
Thank you, Sophia.
Okay, for By the Numbers this week, I'm going to bring in Ryan Murphy, a program assistant with the GeoEconomics Center and the Economic Statecraft Initiative. Hey, Ryan.
Hi, Sophia. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Good to have you here. Okay, let's look at your research.
Excellent. So what you're looking at here, and the numbers for this edition is 6 versus 244. And what that means is there were 6 consultations last year in 2023 at the World Trade Organization, or WTO, and there were 244 trade concerns raised. And so you see this massive divergence, particularly after 2019, between these two numbers.
Okay, so this is pretty timely since the 13th Ministerial is coming up. Okay, so let's dive into this a little bit more. So on this left-hand chart, we have requests for consultations. Can you walk us through what that really means and why we should care about it?
Absolutely. So when talking about concerns and consultations, it sounds very dry, but it really is how just a little bit, very minutiae in the WTO. But what we're talking about is how countries resolve their trade disputes with one another. And so when we're looking at trade concerns, this is the result of committees that are formed with a lot of WTO members for specific issue areas. And that's where they bring up things, regulations, rules, laws of other members that are concerning to them or that seem like unfair trade practices. And the critical thing to note here is that this is not a formal arbitration process. The formal arbitration process, and this goes back all the way to the original GATT through the Uruguay round, is this idea of consultations. Consultations is the first step between two countries to resolve a potential trade dispute. And so while you see countries that are really concerned and bringing these topics to the table, you're not seeing them move from the table. You're seeing them quite literally tabled before they get to this kind of more formal adjudication.
Okay, and so we're talking about trade disrupting measures like tariffs, subsidies, that sort of thing, right?
Exactly, yes.
Okay, so these two graphs are pretty stark, and you mentioned that 2019 was really a turning point. That's about 5 years ago now. What was happening around this time?
Absolutely, yeah. So what we see, even as early as 2017, is the United States having a blockade on the appointment of WTO appellate body judges. And the appellate body is about 7 members. They adjudicate some of these disputes that come through this consultation process. And it's critical that they have a quorum. The quorum is 3 members. And in December of 2019, that fell below quorum. And so this body has not been functioning effectively since 2019, since the Trump administration. And this has continued through the Biden administration. So even as recently as the G20 meeting in New Delhi, Catherine Tai, U.S. Trade Representative, had talked about this body needing a fundamental rethink. And so there's a real issue here, at least from the perspective of the United States, that's maintaining this blockade of this body overstepping its boundaries, and therefore they have not made future appointments to this group.
Okay, so I want to go beyond the lines a little bit. So how are these 2 data points distributed among the WTO members? Are there any particularly active members?
Yes, actually, surprisingly, the United States and the European Union, EU, are the most active members for both consultations and trade complaints. And one of the really interesting data points is that for cases where the United States is a complainant, usually against China or the European Union, they win almost 90% of their cases. And so while there is this concern at the federal level with the administration that the appellate body, the resolution process is flawed, the United States actually does, when it is pursuing these trade complaints for unfair trade practices, it actually does win the majority of these cases.
So it does seem like it would be in the US interest to get that fundamental rethink. Do you think that's likely? Do you think that's going to happen?
So we should keep our eyes on the 13th Ministerial Conference. That'll be at the end of the month through the 26th and 29th in Abu Dhabi. One of the things that's been happening is, this was announced at the last Ministerial, a review of this resolution body, reforms to it. And those have been operating on 2 tracks. There's some agreement on the first track over the general principles that should govern the body, but to the actual composition of the appellate body, the actual rules and regulations that would apply day to day, there's still considerable disagreement. And so while you may see some progress here on this general principles, I wouldn't expect to see a major realignment at this 13th Ministerial.
Okay, well, we'll keep our eye on it. Thanks so much, Ryan, for looking into this. It's very timely. Well, thank you so much for watching. This has been Guide to the Global Economy. I'm Sophia Busch, an Assistant Director with the GeoEconomics Center. And if you liked this video, you can go ahead and subscribe, or you can also follow us on Twitter. Thanks so much.